Hello and welcome to episode number 9 of the Scottish History Podcast. My name is Owen and welcome back, or even welcome for the first time. If you are here for the first time, please go back to episode number 1 and work your way through. You don't have to, but to get a rough idea as to what this podcast is about, it would, in my opinion, be a good idea to do so. Once again, to those of you who have been providing any form of feedback, be it constructive feedback or good feedback, to be honest, the majority has been amazing feedback, not even just good feedback. So I'm absolutely delighted, and obviously with the way that things are at this moment in time, podcasts, I would imagine, would be quite popular, along with streaming and things like that. So welcome anyway. Today, I'm going to start talking about the Jacobites. We kind of started with the last podcast, which was on the Massacre of Glencoe, but there's a lot more just to the Jacobite story than would really meet the eye. It was a major part in Scotland's history. So I think it's a good idea to start at the beginning and work our way towards the end. So in later episodes we're going to be talking about Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Battle of Culloden, and then ultimately one of the main requests that I've ever had regarding this podcast was to talk more about the Highland clearances and things like that. You can't really talk about the Highland clearances without setting the scene. And that is a thing about Scottish history, and something that I love so much about it, is not every story can just be told from you've got to start at the beginning. You can't just start at the end of it. So it's better to kind of start at the beginning. And so the Jacobites were really the beginning of it. The time known as the Jacobean period, or the Jacobite period, was really between 1688 and 1750. It did last a whole load longer than that, but that's the in terms of the wars, the uprisings, etc. So the term Jacobite, it comes from Latin Jacobus, meaning James. So to be a Jacobite meant that you were a supporter of James. The James in question was the now exiled King James VII of Scotland and II of England. Jacobitism was like a secret society with various little codes to show that you were a Jacobite supporter. One of those was a white rose, which was adopted round about the 10th of June, and this was to signify James VII's son's birthday, so James, who became then James VIII. And then after the birth of his two sons, his first son Charles and then his second son Henry, the white rose on the 10th of June would be accompanied by 2 rose buds underneath the rose. There was other ways that shown to be a Jacobite were shown in public, but you couldn't really show that you were a Jacobite in public because they were the minority. You had to do it in a kind of secretive way. Now, before a dinner or before a party or whatever, you would normally make a little toast, or during a party or whatever, you would make a little toast. And there was 2 in particular that became synonymous with the Jacobites. The first of those was the Jacobites would raise a glass to the little gentleman in the black velvet coat. This was a toast that was being drank to a mole. So, you know, the little blind burrowing animals. William III, William of Orange, basically, who's mentioned in the Massacre of Glencoe story, William III died as a result of a fall from a horse. The horse had stumbled on a molehill, so on a hill that was left behind by this burrowing mole. So the horse tripped up on that. William fell off and died as a result of that. So this toast to the little gentleman in the black velvet coat, moleskin, velvet, it was a toast to the mole that built the hill that killed William. And the other one was to raise a glass and toast to the king over the water. But you couldn't say to the king over the water, because then everybody would know what you were talking about. So the Jacobites would have a jug of water that would, or a glass of water, something like that, on the table. And what they would do is they would raise their glasses and they would toast to the king, and one by one wave the glass over the jug of water to signify that they were then drinking to the king over the water. Over the water, of course, being in France and then latterly in Italy. For this reason as well, just as an additional little fact, jugs of water were actually banned in Buckingham Palace from this time until the late 20th century. So you couldn't find a jug of water in Buckingham Palace on any of the dining tables, which I thought was quite interesting. So there is a common misconception about the Jacobites, and these common misconceptions usually come from modern media. For example, let's just put it out there, Outlander. The common misconception is that Jacobitism was another war between Scotland and England. It wasn't. And also that it was just Catholics versus Protestants sort of thing, which was totally untrue and totally unfounded. Jacobites were from all over the place. Jacobites could have been Scottish, Highland, Lowland, Islanders, whatever. They were also English, Welsh, Irish, French, Italian, Spanish. They came from all over. Basically, to be a Jacobite meant that you considered that the exiled Stuart monarchs, so James the 7th and then James the 8th, Prince Charles, etc., that you considered them as the true monarchs of Britain. That's what being a Jacobite was. So it wasn't just to do with Catholicism and Protestantism. There was Protestants who thought that James, regardless, was by divine right the actual true monarch of Britain, so therefore he should be returned to the throne. Now, in total, the Jacobite uprisings. Now, so there's two different ways in which you can explain Jacobitism, or the wars as such: Jacobite uprising and Jacobite rebellion. Essentially, these really mean the same thing, but the Jacobite uprising is the pro-Jacobite side of things. So, if you were a Jacobite, you would call it an uprising because you were rising up against the enemy, sort of thing. Whereas the rebellion, Jacobite rebellion, was the anti-Jacobite side. So it was a rebellion from the eyes of the British government, basically. In total, there were 5 attempts to restore the Stuarts to the throne. The first of those was in March 1689. James VII and II landed in Ireland, but was defeated on the 1st of July in 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne by William III. And as explained before then, after William III's death, due to injuries sustained after he fell from his horse, which had tripped up on a molehill, again hence where the little gentleman in the black velvet coat comes from, James VII's sister Anne took the throne, during which the second attempt was made from France but failed in 1708. Anne was also considered to be the last ever Stuart monarch. Not even just considered to be, she realistically was. She was the last monarch to sit on the throne with the surname Stuart. When she died, she was replaced by George, the Elector of Hanover, who was the great-grandson of James VI, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James VI. Now, George himself, George I, was German. He was from Hanover, obviously, in Germany. And he didn't speak much English. He didn't really care for Britain at all. But essentially, he was basically just told, listen, this is your country now. You look after it from now on. And you're now the king. And he took it, who wouldn't, really? So the third attempt to restore the Stuarts was in 1715. This is when the Earl of Mar raised the Jacobite clans to fight for James VII's son, also called James and known around the world now as James VIII of Scotland and 3rd of England. The reason why he was known as King James VIII or 3rd is because James himself was again brought up a Catholic. The one person in the world who would release the news on who the new monarch was of course the Pope. Is the Pope a Catholic? I think so. So that's where you get that from. However, James VIII was also known by anti-Jacobites as the Old Pretender. During this uprising, Mar led the Jacobites at the Battle of Sheriff Muir on the 13th of November 1715, which did end up a draw. But James VIII arrived in the Firth of Forth, just basically at Edinburgh. He arrived too late, and then the French ship took him back to France. So that basically put an end to that one. So that was attempt number 3. Attempt number 4 was in 1719. This was an attempt hugely supported by Spain and Spanish troops, but this attempt ended after defeat at the Battle of Glen Shiel. Now, with the 4th attempt, a lot of people will probably know of Eilean Castle. Now, Eilean Castle sits in a place called Loch Alsh. Well, it sits on the edge of 3 separate lochs in Scotland now. I mean, we're now on episode 9, and I don't think I've explained what a loch is. A loch it's very similar to its English counterpart, which is lake. So Loch Ness, for example, is the Lake Ness, etc. But we call them lochs. Please continue to call them lochs. And if you wouldn't mind as well, practice that pronunciation, loch. So Eilean Castle sits at the meeting point of 3 lochs. You've got Loch Duich, Loch Alsh and Loch Long. This is one of a few Loch Longs. So Loch Alsh is the county, I suppose, that it's in. So it's the area which is known as called Skye, and Loch Alsh is just before you reach the end of the Scottish mainland to head over to the Isle of Skye via the Skye Bridge. So Eilean Castle was quite a big part of this particular uprising. That is where the Spanish troops had been garrisoned. They were waiting there for supplies to come in from France and from Spain. They were waiting for the big supply ships carrying gunpowder, weapons, and that sort of thing. But instead of these supply ships coming, there was 3 British naval ships that came up instead. These 3 British naval ships started bombarding that castle over the course of 3 days, basically just absolutely bombarding the castle with gunpowder and cannonballs, etc. But the castle was quite strong and it stood firm. On the 3rd day, the British commander basically led his troops ashore to the castle itself, and the Spanish troops inside therefore surrendered. After the surrender, the British troops then decided to prevent the Jacobites from using this castle as any form of base once again. They ransacked the castle, they find whatever weapons, etc. that they could. But if memory serves me correctly, there was about 300 barrels of gunpowder hidden underneath the castle, in the stores underneath the castle. The British troops took most of it, but they left around about 30 barrels, set up a fuse, lit the fuse, and blew the castle to smithereens. The castle which sits there now, which is famous from so many films, James Bond: The World Is Not Enough. Probably one of the biggest ones is Highlander. I think that's one that most people would recognise it from. And I think a more recent film is Maid of Honour. Of course, people have got a lot of spare time at this moment in time. Go and watch those films. I mean, Highlander, of those three films, in my opinion, is probably the worst of them. But that's just for supernatural reasons. I didn't understand that film. But Eland Donning Castle is featured in these ones. I also mentioned another film on the Facebook page that I saw last week. It's a film about Robert the Bruce. Unsurprisingly, the film is just called Robert the Bruce. Highly regarded as a sequel almost to Braveheart, because Angus MacFadyen, who played Robert the Bruce in the original Braveheart film back in 1995, he reprises his role as Robert the Bruce. He wrote most of the film. It's not that great. I wouldn't recommend not watching it, but I also wouldn't rush to go and watch it. It's also in that film. Eland Donning Castle is also in that film. The Eland Donning Castle, which stands today, was built on the original foundations left by this explosion in 1715. But the castle, as we know it now, was actually completed in the 1930s. A lot of people think that the castle's a lot older. I mean, it's an impressive castle. I recommend that you go. If you're ever in Scotland, I recommend that you do go and see it. But it's not as old as you might think. So the fifth and final attempt was what most Scots would just refer to as the 45. 1745 into 1746, August 1745 till April 1746. And this one was led by Prince Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender. But that's where we're going to pick up on the next episode. So we're going to pick up on that in episode number 10. So again, though, although Jacobitism has been explained in most media to be another fight between England and Scotland, it was far from it. It is easier to be explained as a religious civil war. A tough time for Scotland before, during, and after, as we're going to find out as we go through the next few episodes. So that's it for this week. Once again, I just want to apologise for the lack of podcasts over the last few weeks. There has been a lot going on over here, as I'm sure you can imagine. I was going to be going back. I was kind of saving that for a time, but I was going to be going back to become a full-time tour guide. But this worldwide scenario has kind of changed that. I did, however, manage to get another job driving buses, so I'm not stuck by any means. But thank you for all the well wishes, folks. Please continue to connect on the Facebook page. Obviously, just go to Facebook, type in the Scottish History Podcast. You'll be able to find me. Twitter as well, at Scott History Pod, and email, same thing, scotthistorypod@gmail.com. We're also on YouTube. Go on YouTube, type in the Scottish History Podcast, and you'll find the author Owen Innes. Just click on that. I've set it up as a playlist, so once you go there you can click on that and it'll just play you episode 3. It starts at episode 3, episode 1 and 2, and the first of the bonus episodes are stored on an old laptop that is not functioning correctly at this moment in time. So because of that, I can't gain access in order to put them up on the YouTube page. I might be able to find another way of doing it, but at the moment it's just from episode 3 onwards. We are, of course, still on iTunes, Spotify, and many other podcast-related websites. Please head to those websites. Please give us a little listen. Give us a rate, a review via Facebook, whatever. Please send me some emails. Give me some suggestions and things like that. What you'll also notice is I've decided to not put music in the podcast anymore. Couple of reasons for this. The song I was using, I thought was I bought it from a website, but it turns out that it is still copyright protected, so therefore I don't want any issues with that. The music will remain on the original podcasts, because then that takes away my views and listens, unfortunately, selfish reasons. I do write a little bit of music myself, but if anybody out there has any music, plays the bagpipes, for example, I would very much like to hear from you, to see if we can maybe collaborate and get a proper theme song for this podcast moving forward. That's the plan. The other reason why is potentially I would maybe like to in some way monetize this podcast. It does actually cost me money to make this. I mean, it's not a huge amount of money, but so I was thinking something along the lines of Patreon or something like that. Just send it like £1 a month. If I get 10 people, 15 people, 20 people, £20 a month is more than enough to keep this going. However, I don't want to be cheeky, because I haven't actually had a podcast out for a couple of weeks. But moving forward, I should have plenty more time than I ever did before, especially over the next week or so. I'm going to try and stockpile some of the podcast moving forward. But anyway, that's enough. Let's end that there. The next episode will be on Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites, moving on from what we've just talked about today. If you've got any questions, again, please send them in. Facebook, Twitter, email, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify. Please check us out. Share it around your friends as well, especially at this difficult time. Someone out there might be interested in what we're talking about here. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time.